Chapter 5. Henry sat on the floor of the landing and watched his uncle fiddle with the doorknob. "Here it comes," Uncle Frank said, and pulled. The knob rattled off in Frank's hand. "What's that spike thing?" Henry asked. "That, Henry, is the spike thing that sticks through the door and holds the knob things." He looked at Henry and waggled his eyebrows. "Now we're going to be a little more gutsy than I have been in the past. She's waited 2 years, and I figure she's been patient enough." Frank put his thumb on the end of the protruding spike and pushed. It herked and jerked a bit, but went all the way into the door. When it was behind the old brass cover plate, Uncle Frank used a screwdriver to push it the rest of the way through. Henry heard a thump on the other side of the door. "That's the knob dropping on the other side," Uncle Frank said. "We aren't putting it back on unless we get the door open. I'll tell you something, Henry. Today I'm going to do something I've resisted doing for 2 years. If the door won't open, we're going to bash it in. It's a nice old door. Not many like it around anymore. I'd hate to bust it up, but it'll probably be the jamb that splits." "Do you think it will open?" Henry asked. "Nope," Frank said, "but I'm not going downstairs with my head hanging. I'll poke and prod the insides a bit, then I'll start kicking." The poking and prodding lasted about 45 minutes. The cover plate came off. Everything that Frank could get at came off. Screwdrivers stabbed and twisted. Finally, Uncle Frank stood, put his hands on his lower back, leaned backward, and rocked to the sides. The cat walked past Henry and rubbed itself on Frank's leg. "Well, here we go. Lord forgive me." Frank raised his right foot and kicked hard against the door just where the knob had been. There was a scream downstairs. "Is it open?" Dottie yelled. "Quiet, woman," Frank yelled back. "Soon will be." He kicked again. The door didn't budge, but it made an enormous sound like a huge wooden drum. Frank backed up as much as the landing would allow, took 5 quick steps, and jumped at the door. His body piled into it and then piled onto the floor. The cat, who had been observing from the corner, strolled away. Henry didn't say anything. He tried to keep on not saying anything, and then he laughed. Frank began laughing as well, but quickly stopped himself. "Gotta get this thing open," he said. "I have never seen an oak door this solid, and this one's fir." "Fir? Is fir like pine?" Henry asked. "I thought pine was soft." "It is. Fir's a bit different, but not this different." Frank examined the wood of the door. "Looks like fir. Grain might be a little funny, but still fir. Look out, Henry. I'm going to try to hurt myself again. Then we'll get drastic." Henry scooted further back. "Seen this in a movie once," Uncle Frank said. "He rocked in place and took 4 steps and jumped. He put his feet out in front of him and leaned back. When his feet hit the door, he fell backward and landed hard, flat on his back with his legs up the door." He was gasping. "Are you okay, Uncle Frank?" Henry asked. "Should I get Aunt Dottie?" "No," Frank gasped. "Just my wind. Knocked out." He sat up slowly, then stood. "You wait here. I'll be right back. Gotta be a bit sneaky." He put his finger to his lips, then crept down the stairs. After a moment, Henry heard his Aunt Dottie's voice. "Frank, what are you doing?" "Just grabbing a few more tools. Back in a minute." "How's it going?" "Not too bad." Henry heard the back door slam. He was alone with his thoughts and the cat, who had reappeared and was now cleaning himself at the other end of the landing. Henry looked at the cat. The cat looked at him. "Sorry about that whole thing last time," Henry said. The cat looked him over, then went back to collecting hair with its tongue. Henry sat on the green carpeted landing for 5 minutes. He finally grew impatient and stood up to go to his room. At the same moment, Uncle Frank rose out of the stairwell holding an axe. The head was all rust and a little red paint, but the edge looked sharp. Henry wondered when his uncle had last used it, or if he just kept it on a regular sharpening schedule like Aunt Dottie's knives. Frank gripped the axe handle and laughed. "Here we are, Henry. We've grown serious." Henry stepped out of the way as Uncle Frank approached the door. His uncle reached up to his neck and fished out a black string from inside his shirt. A silver ring dangled at the end. Frank kissed it quickly and tucked it back into his shirt. As he turned his hips, his right hand slid to the top of the axe handle and his left dropped to the bottom. He shifted his weight from foot to foot and tipped his head from side to side. It was obvious to Henry that while Frank may have been out of axe practice, he had once done a great deal and enjoyed it immensely. Frank swung, his hips squaring and his right hand sliding down the handle to meet the left. Grandfather's door had once been a normal fir. It had 4 panels, 2 large vertical rectangles at the top and 2 smaller ones at the bottom. Its stain was dark like walnut, but there was a lot of red buried beneath it. The color would pull the eyes, then duck and run, calling for them to try and find it. Eyes never could, but they knew it was there somewhere. There are places where whole forests of trees have been petrified and turned to stone. Usually this happens at the bottom of lakes after volcanic eruptions. Grandfather's door had not been petrified, and it was not stone, but it was something very close. Its core was stronger than stone because it was less brittle. Frank's axe might have cracked a petrified door, but not Grandfather's. The axe blade rattled the wood and ricocheted back. Frank leaned the axe against the wall, shook his hands, and examined the mark he had made. He had struck in the groove beside the top panel on the right side of the door. It was as thin as any part of the door, and the axe should have broken right through. Instead, the notch left by his swing was no more than 1/8 of an inch deep. Frank didn't say anything. He didn't look at Henry. He grabbed the axe and began swinging. Henry watched blow after blow bounce off the door. Left and right, Frank swung, always along the edges of the panels. The axe hopped and skipped, slid and twisted. Breathing heavily, Frank finally stopped and wiped the sweat from his head. There were small slivers of wood all over the carpet. "Henry," he said between gasps, "I'm not sure this'll work." He picked up the axe and ran his finger along its blade. "Dull already," he muttered. "Are we giving up?" Henry asked. "Nope, we're going to a barbecue tonight. I told Dots that one way or another it'd be open before we left. You can run, do whatever. I've got to think on this for a bit." "Are you sure? Do you need me to do anything?" "Nope. Scram." Henry went to Grandfather's door and felt it with his hands. The notches were shallow, but there was a lot of them. "Why doesn't the axe work?" "Dunno. That's what I gotta think on. Your grandpa was a weird one, just as selfish dead as alive. But this is stranger than anything. Run on now. I'm heading out to the barn. You'll hear me when I'm back if you want to watch my last stand." With that, Frank wandered back downstairs with the blunt axe over his shoulder. Henry did not hold still for long. Once his uncle was out of sight, he scrambled up the attic stairs and immediately applied his fingernails to the paint on the small door. A moment later, he hopped off his bed and ran down both flights of stairs before walking calmly to the dining room table, where he retrieved his newly sharpened knife. Then he reversed direction and hurried back to his room. Sitting on his bed, Henry examined the new edge on his now much smaller knife blade. Frank had taken at least 1/3 of the blade off, but it was really sharp. Henry was a little afraid to touch it. Still, he rubbed his thumb across the blade and knew that what he held was truly dangerous. It looked at Henry's fingers in an insinuating way, as if to say, "You wouldn't be the first. Why do you think they got rid of me?" The edge, as Dottie had warned, was not straight, nor was the curve of the blade consistent. It was frozen in a ripple, like the surface of a windy lake. Henry bent down and scraped at the paint with his knife. It came off easily, but in very narrow strips. It was not a large area, only 1 inch or so high and about 3 wide, but it took him a while. When the paint was finally off, the glass still did not look anything like you would be able to see through. Henry put his knife down, cupped his hands over the glass, and was staring intently into complete lightlessness when he heard feet on the attic stairs. He knew it had to be Henrietta, but he still jumped and was outside of his room with the door shut by the time she reached the top. She was lugging a cardboard box under one arm. "Hi," she said, smiling. "I brought a bunch of posters from the barn. Dad had a box he forgot about. They're all the same basketball guy, and they say University of Kansas, national champions, even though Dad says they weren't that year. He thought he could sell them to people in England who wouldn't know better, but they didn't want them, so he says you can have them all. I brought tape, too, and a chisel. Why couldn't Dad get Grandpa's door open? Did you get the paint off?" She dropped the box of posters on the floor. "I stuck the chisel in the bottom." "Thanks," Henry said. "I got the paint off, but I still can't see anything. It's all smeary." They went into his room, and Henrietta examined the small door. "I think it's a mailbox," she said. "What do you mean, a mailbox?" Henry ran his fingers over the grooves in the little door. It doesn't look anything like a mailbox. The kind in post offices, Henrietta said. I used to go to the post office with Mom sometimes, and there are little boxes like this there. You mean post office boxes? Henry prodded the glass with his knife. Why would there be a post office box in my bedroom? Henrietta laughed. Why would any of these be in your bedroom? I don't know, Henry said. I guess someone could have just been sort of a collector, you know, of little things with doors. They must have just liked cupboards. No, Henrietta said, it has to be more exciting than that. Henrietta sat up on the bed and crossed her legs. Somebody hid them all, so they're supposed to be secret. We have to get them open and find out why. Do you think we'll ever be able to see through this little one? Henry cupped his hands against the small door and peered in. Henrietta pushed him out of the way. She licked and slobbered all over the ends of her fingers and then rubbed them on the glass. Then she pulled her sleeve down over her hand and wiped it clean. Henry looked in again. It's clear enough, he said, but I still can't see anything. We need a flashlight. I've got one in my room. Henrietta jumped up. It didn't take her long to get it, and when she came back in, she closed both doors tight behind her and stepped over to Henry's reading light. When she turned it off, the room was near pitch. Except for the trickle of daylight that filtered beneath the doors, there was no light at all. Henry tried not to shiver. This wasn't make-believe. He really had found these doors, and he didn't know what was inside them. He suddenly wondered why something hidden inside a secret cupboard would have to be pleasant. Henrietta flipped on her flashlight and handed it to him. Take it, she said. Look in the door. You found it. Henry took it. He knelt on his bed, put the flashlight beside his right eye. Swallowing hard, he looked. I think I can see something. He shifted his head. It looks like an envelope. He handed the flashlight to Henrietta and knee-waddled out of her way. She bent and looked. It looks skinnier than an envelope, she said. Maybe a postcard. Henry leaned his hand against the wall and bent over to look. Move your head a bit, he said. She did, and he looked again, bracing himself against the cupboard wall. He was holding on to something metal. It slid, and he fell over onto Henrietta. She screamed. They both fell off the bed. Above them, a cupboard door banged against the wall. Henry lay still, all of his senses straining. The flashlight was off. His eyes hurt, they were open so wide. He could make out Henrietta on the floor by the light from the door. He could smell something big and feel a cold wind on his skin. He could hear rustling and Henrietta holding back tears. He could taste fear in the back of his throat, constricted to the point of pain. Henry had never thought of himself as brave. He never had been. What he did next wasn't a terrific act of bravery, but it did take effort. With every inch of his skin crawling at the touch of cold, moving air, he sat up, found his way to the head of his bed, and turned on his light. The cupboard door just above the post office box was open and swinging gently back and forth, lightly tapping the wall, then almost closing. He looked at Henrietta. She looked back at him, her face white and eyes wide. "Are you okay?" he whispered. "What is it doing?" she asked. Henry reached up and held his hand in front of the moving door. "There's air coming through it." They both held still for a moment, listening. "Can you hear that?" she asked. "What is it?" "It sounds like trees blowing around," Henry said. "Should we look inside?" Henrietta asked. Henry climbed onto his bed. A cool wind pushed around his face and through his hair as it came out of the cupboard. Henry held the door still. Henrietta climbed up beside him. "There's something inside. On the bottom," Henry said. He stretched out his hand. He could barely see what he was stretching for. It was simply a shape. His hand felt something enclosed. It was a string. He pulled the string out of the cupboard. Dangling below his fingers was a small key. The wind blowing out of the cupboard suddenly became a gust. Henry's bedroom doors blew open and dust shuffled and rolled across the floor toward the attic window. The noise of the trees roared like a waterfall. The two of them could hear boughs bending and creaking. Then they smelled it, sudden and fresh. Somewhere on the other side of the cupboard, rain had begun to fall. "Shut it quick," Henrietta said. "Mom and Dad will hear it. They'll feel it." Henry pushed the door closed on the wind. Then he slid the metal latch, and the room was quiet. How did you get it unlocked? Henrietta asked. I don't think it was locked, Henry said. It must have just been stuck. I leaned on it to look through the glass and it came open. Henrietta's hair was coming loose in the front. She brushed it back and put her eyebrows up. It's magic, she said. We can't pretend it's not. It's a magic cupboard. They're probably all magic. Henry shifted on the bed and looked away. I don't think it's magic, he said. I think it's just something really unusual. Henry, Henrietta said. She leaned forward and spoke slowly. It's not raining outside, and we don't have any trees back there. I know, Henry said. I just think it's something like quantum. What's quantum? Henrietta asked. Well, Henry said, my dad says it's when things can sometimes be where they aren't, or two places at once. Sounds like magic. No, it's natural, Henry said. He was rocking nervously. It just happens. You couldn't make something quantum? Henrietta asked. It's only for really little things. The cupboard's little. No, Henry said, really little, and trees and rain and wind aren't little. Okay, they're too big to be quantum, Henrietta said, so it has to be magic. Henry wasn't sure what to say. He would have liked to discover that the whole thing was just some sort of trick, that he wouldn't really be sleeping beside a bunch of magic cupboards, but he didn't know any other way to explain what had just happened. I don't know, he finally said. Henrietta shivered suddenly, bounced up on her knees, and focused her wide eyes on Henry. Aren't you excited to see what's behind the other doors? There could be all sorts of things. Henry sat very still. Aren't you scared at all? He asked. I mean, we might find something bad. Everybody always finds bad things, she said, and things only get hidden like this if they're really bad or really good. She bounced again. We'll just have to find out. I don't know, Henry said again. Despite his concerns, he was truly curious about the cupboards. He knew that if they got another one open, he would be terrified. But would he be sick with himself if he didn't try. Do you think the key opens another one? Henrietta pointed at it. Henry looked down at the key in his hand. He was about to say, I don't know, for the third time when a rumbling motorcycle sounding engine fired up at the bottom of his stairs. Shoving the key in his pocket, he and Henrietta scrambled down the stairs. At the bottom, they found Uncle Frank wearing plastic goggles and standing in front of Grandfather's door with a chainsaw. He began singing something, then braced himself and pulled the trigger. As a cloud of black smoke blew out of the back of the saw, the chain blade spun into loud motion. He leaned the blade back slowly and lowered it onto the door. When it touched, wood chips began flying all over the landing. It looked like Frank was fighting to keep the blade from sliding. It began to skid, and Frank spread his legs a little more. Then the saw caught on something and kicked back. The full force of the spinning chainsaw threw Frank against the wall. He jumped as the saw, barely in his left hand, swung down toward his legs. It didn't hit them, but its nose caught the floor. In one short second, the saw dug itself in, shredding and wrapping the long strands of green carpet around itself. There, nestled cozily into the floor, it idled. Panting, Frank reached down and turned off the engine. Dottie was at the top of the stairs. She looked at Frank, then at the saw burrowed into the landing. She looked at Frank again. Time to go, she said. We're due at the barbecue. You okay, Frank? Frank rubbed his cheek on his arm. My pride's on the lower end, he said. Floor's a bit dinged. He reached down and pulled at the quiet saw. It wouldn't budge. I'll cut it out later, Dots. Sorry about, He sighed and put his hands on his head. I figure I'll have to go through the bathroom wall. Mr. Willis, Aunt Dottie said, I'm not sure if the house will survive you. Now I think you need a hot dog. Frank seemed relieved. Come on, kids, Dottie added. We're going to be late for the barbecue. Henry and Henrietta followed her down the stairs, glancing back at Grandfather's door and the saw. Frank came behind, still wearing his goggles. There were wood chips in his hair.